Hello, advocates. My name is Desiree Kamika, and I'm the National Coordinator for the Coalition for Community Choice, one of 3 housing projects of the Madison House Autism Foundation. I am so excited to announce some new sub-regulatory guidance from the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS. But before I share this guidance with you, I kind of got to give you a little bit of a background. So in 2014, CMS released this new set of regulations called the HCBS Final Rule, Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule. And the purpose of these regulations was to make sure that this HCBS waiver funding, right, funding that waives the need for institutional care in order to access services, this way people can access services in their home and community, that those type of settings were actually home and community based, and we're honoring people's choice and autonomy and giving them the most options possible in order to access the supports that they need to go ahead and live their life and meet their goals. Part of those regulations was something called a person-centered plan. And there's very specific elements of the person-centered plan, and we created this handy-dandy PDF that you can download in the links below that tell you exactly what the final regulations require in order to access waiver funding. You have to have a person-centered plan. And these regulations had very specific elements to what would be required for HCBS settings. And they were all outcome oriented, which means they weren't based on setting size or density of persons with disabilities or even programmatic elements, but that they were based on outcomes. So for example, people had access to food at all times, right? Maybe in an institution, you could only eat food at certain times, but in one's home and community, you should be able to go to the fridge and access food at all times. Having visitors. If you're living and being treated in an institutional setting, you can't just have visitors whenever you want. In your home and community, you should be able to have visitors when you want to have visitors. These are some of the examples, having a door that locks, being able to have that type of privacy. These are all examples of things that were required in the new regulations for HCBS settings. If you had trouble being able to meet those type of regulations because maybe you have pica and being able to have access to food at all times is actually a major health risk, you could use your person-centered plan to describe why you can't meet the regulatory requirements and some of the steps that you're taking to be able to meet them in the future, right? They are modifications of the rule. So these regulations were based on outcomes and one's person-centered plan. Well, CMS started to release guidance, and this guidance was to help states and advocates understand how they were going to make their state comply with these new regulations. And one of the things that HCBS funding cannot be used for are settings that isolate. And one of the guidances that was sub-regulatory guidance that was released was specifically on settings that tend to isolate. And in this guidance, they stigmatized really farmsteads, disability-specific communities, residential schools, and any sort of campus model or intentional community where people with disabilities can choose to live. They were presumed to be institutional and isolating, and therefore would have to go through a lengthy and expensive process called heightened scrutiny. Well, that was really not fair to people who lived in these settings or who want to live in these type of settings because they're not all isolating and they're not all institutional. And so advocates all across the country, along with the Coalition for Community Choice, started telling CMS and their state Medicaid authorities, hey, this isn't fair. There's no reason why we should go through this lengthy and invasive and expensive process. Dun, 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 dun. That is why we now have this new guidance, is because you all raised your voice and CMS listened. And so in this new guidance, they've redefined what is considered isolating. And so they've taken that old guidance that kind of stigmatized specific types of settings that weren't really based on outcomes or quality of life, but just on what they look like and where they were located. They threw that to the side and they have given us new guidance. So now the new guidance shows exactly what isolating means, but more an outcome-oriented projection. So it's talking about if an individual wants to be able to do something in their community, but their service provider doesn't let them do that, that could be an isolating setting. Or if they're located outside and apart from the community, so say they're located on a farmstead, and that farmstead, the provider who supports that individual doesn't get them out into the community in the ways in which it's documented in their person-centered plan, that is isolating because it's based on outcomes, how it's impacting an individual's life. So this is really exciting news. They also said that a consumer-controlled setting is presumed to be compliant. Before, that wasn't the case. And this is an important detail to know, the difference between provider-controlled and consumer-controlled. A provider-controlled setting is when one's houses and their services are inextricably connected. So that means the person who is supporting you is also your landlord. In a consumer-controlled setting, your housing and your services are totally separate. So your landlord is not the person who is providing Medicaid long-term support services to you. So if you live in a setting in which your landlord is not your service provider, then you can presume that your home is going to be compliant with the final rule. And so just make sure that you have a person-centered plan that is up to date and has all of the details that's required in the federal regulations. So this is really exciting news. We should all be thanking CMS for listening to our voices. Of course, there's some potential concerns for the future, but really this barrier to so many existing and emerging options has really been taken down, and it has gone back to the intent of the final rule, which was focusing on outcomes and making sure that one's supports are person-centered. So thank you so much for getting a little rundown. All of the links to some of these documents are going to be below. So exactly what is required in the HCBS final rule for settings that are compliant with the new federal regulations. It's important to note that states can have more restrictive regulations, but right now that's not the case for most states. 2, you'll have the document that tells you exactly what's needed in your person-centered plan, especially those who might need modifications to the requirements. You're going to want to take a look at what's required for documented modifications. You're going to have a link to the new guidance as well as the complete HCBS compliance toolkit from the CMS website. And of course, you'll have links to the Autism Housing Network and the Coalition for Community Choice website, which has a lot more information. I'm so excited that we have this new guidance. Thank you, CMS, and kudos to all of you advocates. I know so many of you wrote letters and made appointments and visited your policymakers, and that is so important. So continue to be great advocates, because I'm sure we'll have much more work to do in the future. Thank you very much and have a great week.